Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming back and be here on time. So we are starting the last part of this conference. And first of all, I would like to thank very much all the participants for their very thoughtful interventions and also for sending me their papers right in advance. It was extremely interesting to read them all. And second, I would like also to thank Samantha for organizing this conference and for her courses also during the spring semester, with which I could fortunately catch up through the excellent podcast of the Collège de France. More specifically, thank you very much, Samantha, for having chosen this topic and for having put so much effort trying to decipher what is probably the most important political questions of our days. It's indeed extremely important to work on the issue of democratization of international organizations today, because the responses we will collectively give to the questions we are asking ourselves today may have a major influence on our future. We're talking about the present and the future of democracy, and if we think about it, it might well be an existential question. So you have heard Samantha in the beginning, kicking off the conference, saying that the conclusions were not meant to summarizing and closing the debate, but instead enabling us to revert to some of the issues addressed over the 2 days and maybe identify further issues for research. And you've noticed the specific format. The conclusions won't close the discussion, as we will continue. We will reopen the discussion after the conclusions. And I really welcome that format, as I told Samantha several times, because when you have the last word in making conclusions, you feel somehow compelled to a certain neutrality, making summaries, but avoiding as much as possible to give your own opinion, something which I really think is hard, sitting there 2 days. You want to give your opinion at some point. You want to say and give your comments. That said, I think the main reason why we are here is because Samantha has invited us to comment on her scientific proposal and basically her framework developed together in a paper with José Luis Martí of democratic representation in, through, and by international organizations. And even more specifically, her proposal of multiple international representation systems. I won't call it with the acronym MIRS. And I think everybody here made some comments that show that there is some part of agreement with Samantha's and José Luis' proposals, but also, as this is natural in all scientific discussions, there is also some part of disagreement. But before starting, I must make the point that in the time that I have, I may not be able to cite everybody. So apologies to those that I don't quote or don't cite. But of course, every contribution will be reflected in the written version of this paper. So listening to you and trying to follow the instructions of Samantha, I did not draw some conclusions, but rather I tried to ask some questions. And I came up with 4 questions. And what I would like to do is to go through these questions. And the first question is simply, why should we be discussing democracy in international organizations in the first place? Some, including in the international law field, may object to the need to discuss that matter because they may argue that international organizations are already democratic because all states are equal, which translates in international organizations with the rule one state, one vote, So it's a democracy of states, but still it's a democracy. And some other may also argue, and sometimes the same, that even if we are to adopt a democratic theory that says that not only states but also peoples should be represented by international organizations, then it's already the case. Based on an indirect responsibility system, states represent peoples, and IOs are made up of states, so IOs are indirectly representing peoples. So in the end, what's the point of discussing? And we should all go back home or maybe outside to enjoy the weather. But I suspect that everybody here in the room, or almost everybody, would disagree with these arguments. At least that's what I heard. Against the first, we can respond, and in fact, Anne, I think, addressed the issue yesterday. The democracy of states is not real democracy, because a real democracy is about peoples, physical persons participating in lawmaking and not states. And against the second argument, we could all agree with Samantha Besson, who says that, I quote, that states are imperfect representatives of their people because of mainly two reasons. Some states are not democratic. We've talked about authoritarian states. And even in democratic states, in fact, peoples are not generally associated with debates, deliberations, discussions that have to do with international affairs, which are a kind of domaine réservé of the executive. So it's hard to say that there is really a democracy. I think that if we want to go deeper and beyond rejecting those two simple objections somehow, we may have a consensus on two sets of reasons why we should be discussing seriously democracies in international organizations today. Even though, after having heard Evelyn, I'm not sure she would join consensus, but so that will be something for the discussion. The first set of reasons are normative reasons. We could agree that democratization is necessary because, A, people have a sentiment that they can't decide anymore on important questions that affect their lives, and this creates frustration and, in turn, a rise of populism, sometimes even fascism in some case, and it puts in danger national democracy. The second reason would be there are more and more global issues like climate change, migration, population, and international organizations are in charge of those global issues. So people should be able to participate in procedures and decision-makings on global issues that are affecting them, that are affecting their daily lives. And a third argument, normative argument, would be to say, well, there is, in fact, in international law, a right to participation, which is a human right to participation in public affairs under Article 25 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which covers not only domestic issues, not only domestic public affairs, but also international affairs. So it's a good legal basis to found a multi-level cosmopolitan democracy, participation of people in international affairs. The second set of reasons are more objective reasons, let's say. It's not really related to what we want or what are the norms, the international norms, but what we scientifically observe in international practice. And what do we see? We see participation in international organizations by various actors, and not only states. We also see that this multiple participation is more and more accepted and recognized even by states, and not only by international organizations and their secretariat. So it's an expanding practice, and we can see that it has been expanding more and more in the last, let's say, 30 years. It's not new that non-state actors are participating, but it's qualitatively and quantitatively unprecedented. So now that we know why we're here, and that we're here for good reasons, we can get into more substantive issues, and that's where reasonable people may reasonably disagree, as a friend would say. So it appears to me that the second question that came out of our debates is whether we really need the concept of representation when we are speaking about democracy in international organizations. Samantha and also José Luis' position is clear, although we had a discussion during lunch, so we may continue this because there might be some kind of misunderstanding, but I think what I understood from the debates and from the paper and from the presentation is the position is very clear. It's a yes. We need representation. We definitely need representation at the international level if we want to have democracy in international organizations. And I guess the main reason that Samantha is putting forward is that, and I quote the paper, the relationship between the concepts of democracy and representation is not instrumental and contingent, but intrinsic and constitutive, and I use the precise words which are used in the paper. So the thesis here is that there cannot be democracy without representation, as I read it. Although we should add immediately that this is a bit more complicated than that, because in the paper we also see that representation alone is not democracy, because democracy, according to Samantha and José Luis, are in fact 4 basic principles. One is the representation principle. We could call it like this, ultimate effective popular control, but there are other 3 principles, the principle of political equality, the principle of deliberative contestability, and the principle of human rights protections. But in other words, even if representation is not the main ingredient, or it's one ingredient among others, I think that the position is that representation is an indispensable ingredient, so it should be there somehow. And here comes the first discussion, because other authors, including some people that are in the room, are not so affirmative about this intrinsic link between democracy and representation. Well, first, I won't be long on that. Everybody knows that there is an ongoing discussion on whether representation is democratic in the first place. In the origins, and if you read Kelsen, or if you read Bernard-Manin, if you Saint-Omer, you see that representation originally is not a democratic institution. Kelsen would rather say, in fact, a bit like yes, it's a way of distributing powers in the society. So it's just a translation of division of labor in the society. It's nothing to do with democracy. It's just that some people are to exercise power and some others are to obey to power. And representation is just the way that you nominate those people or elect those people that have to govern the people that are governed. Well, that's a simple argument, and I won't be long on that. But I think a more interesting argument is the argument that says that not only representation is not intrinsically linked to democracy, but that there can be democracy without representation, which would be, as I understand it, an argument opposed to what is supported in the paper by Samantha and José Luis. And I just quote, there are several, I had several quotations here, but I'm trying to make it short as possible. I'm just quoting here Sabino Cassese, whom you may know as one of the promoters of the theory of global administrative law, so it's more on the side of cosmopolitan theory. And he says, very simply in a book, there is no representative democracy and there are no periodic elections at the global level, but deliberative democracy can work as a surrogate, granting participation in decision-making processes. So we don't need representative democracy, we can have democracy based on deliberative democracy. And with this quote, I think we're reaching maybe, I'm not sure it's the core of the dispute, but it's one aspect of the dispute, and it may be clarified during the discussion, but I think it opposes a cosmopolitan deliberative model of democracy and a model based on representation. A deliberative cosmopolitan model theory would argue, as Sabino Cassese does in this quotation, that representative democracy is virtually non-existent at the international level, but that does not prevent democratization from happening. because you can make democratization happening through putting in place what Jane Mansbridge or John Dryzek call deliberative systems. And I don't want to get into the details here, and Samantha said you should give your own view on this, but I need to go through all the questions that are raised by the main argument. So I won't get into the details of that theory, but it's clearly an alternative theory to the idea that democracy can only be represented with representation, even though it's with some other elements. So now, suppose that we agree that representation is needed, and we support the thesis of the document of the paper, the main paper of the conference, and we agree that representation is needed in international organizations. The next question I think we have discussed is, what is the concept of representation we should be using? And here, my feeling, having read and heard, is that Samantha is giving a very, what I would understand as a very strict definition of representation, that is this first element of democratic legitimacy, ultimate effective popular control. And I read, and I quote, "To comply with the democratic principles of ultimate effective popular control, the relationship of representation should be organized in two stages, authorization and control." And I think it's clear that this very strict conception of representation raises questions, and has raised questions, in fact, during the conference. Several authors, including people present here, have put forward other conceptions, more flexible conceptions of representation, especially so-called descriptive, mimetic, or also statistic conceptions of representation. Edouard Dubourg and Dominique Ritling this morning use a different concept of representative when they speak about the conference on the future of Europe Citizens' Assembly, and the citizens, in fact, that were drawn by lot, something which is excluded in the model designed, the model of representation designed by Samantha. In the author's opinion, those participants constitute mini-publics, and their members are, and I quote, "a new type of representative without the mandate or popular responsibility, because their democratic legitimacy rests above all on the transparency and the quality of the deliberative process in which they participate." Take also, although he wasn't here to present it, but for those who have read the paper, and Franck Petiteville presented it, Jacob Cogan's fourth mode of representation, and he speaks about the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and the Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. The boards of these organizations are open to the participation of non-state actors, which are representative of the most affected people, but are not elected. You know, they are not authorized in any way, and they're not controlled by their constituencies in any way. They're just people that are, you know, members of civil society organizations, and they are people that have an illness, and they can be representative and considered to be representative without elections and without control or without any authorization. I would personally add another example. Take, for instance, and taking my own favorite subject at the moment, take a mother of a person who was forcibly disappeared in a particular country and who gives a personal testimony before the United Nations. She only represents herself. She does not even belong to an association, but still she is representative of a group of peoples who share the same experience in searching their loved ones and who are living the same experience because there is a pattern of disappearances ongoing in the country, and so many people have been victims like her, and she speaks the same experience. Of course, this echoes also what Johann von Bernstorff said about the most affected persons groups. And I quote, I recall the quite striking example he took of an Indian farmer who, when speaking before international organizations, is somehow representing the common experience of billions of farmers in India. So now that we've seen that there are different understandings of representation, and in particular, more flexible understanding than a strict concept, I think the last question that we have to look at, that appeared from our debates, is whether representation in the context of multiple international representation system would be an appropriate way to democratize international organizations. And here, I think what comes out of the discussions is that representation may be necessary in some cases, but that there are also some strong objections, or at least strong or heavy questions about whether we should have representation all across the board as a kind of condition of participation of non-state actors in the activity of international organizations. Let me just rapidly, because time is flying, go through the instances where we need representation. I've just mentioned, for instance, the families of persons who have been victims of enforced disappearances. You need somebody to represent that person because that person is absent. That person is in the jail of the state, has been disappeared. So you need somebody, for instance, to litigate on his or her behalf. Another example is the living other than the humans that do not speak or communicate, and we had a very interesting discussion, I won't come back on that, yesterday on the foundations on which we could understand this kind of representation of animals, for instance, that cannot speak, but still need to express somehow their interest in the discussions and in the deliberations of the humans. So there are limited cases where I think we can all agree that representation in the strict meaning of the term, with authorization and control, is necessary. But beyond that, I think what comes out of the discussion is that there are questions about the practical feasibility of strict representation, as well as about its desirability in the present context of international organizations. First, feasibility. There were several arguments, but I would just mention one argument that was made in various ways by several participants. And this is, how do we make room for participants that cannot be said to be representative in the strict sense of representation, authorization and control? And various types of non-representative legitimacies have been cited here. Epistemic legitimacy that Evelyn calls epistocratic legitimacy, based on knowledge. Power legitimacy, those who can do, those who can deliver, the businesses, Bill and Melinda Gates foundations, they have the money, so they can deliver. The watchdog legitimacy, we talked about watchdog this morning. Those that are speaking the truth to powers, the journalists, the human rights defenders, that are completely alone. They're not representing anybody. Those people that are denouncing human rights violations in their countries, that are investigating on corruption, they don't represent anybody. They are completely alone, but their legitimacy is based on courage de la vérité. I said I would invoke Michel Foucault for Anne. In his keynote speech, Pierre Rosanvallot made eloquently, I think, the point that the most important social movements today are not representatives, in the sense of strict representation. So what do we do with those people? How do we include them in discussion? Desirability of representation. And here I have more questions. I have 4 questions, and I have 6 minutes. And maybe you will grant me a few other minutes for just 2 concluding remarks, conclusions of the conclusion. First question, I think there is an issue, we should discuss it further, but with preference or privilege given to the state as the best representative, the privileged representative of the people. This is something that we obviously find in Republicans' accounts or theories with Philippe Petit, with Francis Chenval, but who explained to us that somehow his theory was circumscribed to European states and democratic states. But this is also something we find in Samantha's paper, this idea that, and I quote, states should still be considered as the most effective institutions to ensure the democratic representations of the people of the world. To that extent, they deserve to retain a central role in the multiple international representation system. There are questions that were raised. Evelyne's somehow criticized this precedence by saying that it's not obvious that the state is the best representative when it comes to global questions, because by nature, states are defending their national interests. So when it comes to global questions, whether the state is the best representative of its people in dealing with climate change is certainly not an obvious assertion. There are other reasons. I could quote Habermas and the fact that I think the state has definitely lost its presumption of innocence in the 20th century. So, trusting the state as being the best representatives, I think at least needs to be open to criticisms, to doubts, critical thinking at all times, and also counterpowers, balance of powers. So that's one thing. The second thing, a second question would be that representative institutions sometimes doesn't work so well. And here we're coming back to the logic of representation against the logic of expedient, which I found very, very interesting as developed by Melissa here. And I have an anecdote. In 1996, I was representing FIDH in New York, and for the negotiation of the new consultative status of NGOs with the ECOSOC, with the Economic Social Council. And at that time, it was post-Cold War, and the institution that was really that was really put in question was the Congo, was the Conference on NGOs, which is the most representative institution you can ever dream of NGOs. There are elections, all those people are elected in an assembly, etc. But these people were considered to be completely useless at that time by national NGOs, which were coming from the South and from the East in countries in democratic transition, and who said, we want to be there. We also want to participate directly, and we don't know why we should entrust those people, those New York NGOs, to represent ourselves. So in this case, I think we should sometimes weigh what is the best representation, at least. Third remark, third question, multiple representation may, or at least that's a question, it's a question whether there is not a risk that it reproduces traditional exclusionary biases of representation. And there is a reason for that, and again, this is something I think we haven't discussed so much, but there is a link between representation, strict representation, and the majority rule. And the majority rule is, we know what it gives, basically. It gives exclusion of people that are on the margin, the minorities, the prisoners, the people in situation of poverty. And these people are generally not represented. And decision-making process in representative model favor the majority rule. Pierre Rosanvallon yesterday spoke in his keynote speech of a new function of representation, which would be a narrative function of representation to shed light on the world of social invisibility, the world of the forgotten and those left behind. But I guess what he was, the concept he was using, the concept of representation he was using was not strict representation in the sense of the electoral process and the rule of the majority here. And finally, the fourth question has to do, and the most important, has to do with whether it will be appropriate that a multiple international representation system replace disorganized what Samantha and José Luis in their paper, and I quote, call the disorganized and inegalitarian plurality of representatives that currently prevails in international organizations. And this leads to two remarks about the desirability of strict representation concept. First, I'm not so sure that the current system of international organizations is so disorganized. It's certainly not very well organized, we have to admit. But I think we already have some rules that allow to include a plurality of actors in the work of our international organizations. There is certainly not a single deliberative system, so we don't have a system, that we can apply everywhere in all international organizations. But there are different sorts of deliberative systems that have been developed empirically in different types of international organizations. But if you look at them, you can find, I think, that they're following more or less the same principles, even though maybe sometimes those principles are not explicitly stated. And I think here we're coming to a central concept, at least as I consider it to be, which have been mentioned yesterday by Yves Saint-Omer, which is the concept of governance. And I won't go into the details because I don't have the time, but briefly speaking, I think we're speaking here about a number of processes that are going on at the international level, which are orchestrated by international organizations, and I think the Global Compact on Refugees, but also the Global Compact on Migration are excellent examples. We have these processes of governance at the international level orchestrated by international organizations, which correspond to a new form of not government, but governance, with new methods, new government techniques, flexible formulas of cooperation, aiming at involving various players concerned in decision-making, including the most affected people, public institutions, private institutions, etc. So we certainly should delve more into this concept of governance and see whether it's not, in fact, the processes that is currently developing in international organizations and it is currently prevailing in international organizations, and whether having representation and strict representation into the system would bring something positive in the end, rather than trying to conceptualize and trying to push forward these concepts or these processes of governance. So, in conclusion, idealism versus realism. I'm always a bit reluctant about when I hear someone says that an idea should not be discussed because it's idealistic. Because history has shown many times that ideals of today are the realities of tomorrow. So the question, I think, is more, what can we do realistically now in the light of our ideals, which might be different? But let's say it's the ideal of democratization that we share in this room. What can we do now realistically? And I would join Antonio Cases with the realistic utopia, which I don't think is the expression of an unsolved problem. I think it's the expression of a methodology. You have the means, and the means have to be realistic, and you have to keep in mind the ideal as a idée régulatrice. And I think the suggestion that comes out of the conference is that there are already some complex processes of governance ongoing through participatory modalities which are more akin to the deliberative model than the strict representation model. So in other words, what we see for the most are practices of deliberation without strict representation, although other meaning of representation may fit: descriptive representation, mimetic representation, statistic representation, etc. The second final conclusion is that I agree that we need more regulation, but mostly we need more understanding of what's going on. What are those processes of governance and under what rules they are operating concretely. The problem, I guess the main problem we have now, if we want to push the democratization agenda forward, is that we have no clear concepts on which we are able to design processes of participation. And for that reason and other reasons, processes of participation are extremely diverse across international organizations, and their quality also, we must agree, are also extremely variable. About business participation, Marike made the point that what was perceived as problematic was not business participation per se, but rather the modalities of participation, which are still unclear. Now, what are the roles, what is the status, etc. So we missed the concept. And I think Melissa also insisted on the need to create a separate track of participation for businesses. By the way, this is something, that, and we had this discussion during lunch, that was somehow advocated by a number of political philosophists, including Habermas, that you have to separate the state, the market, and civil society organizations. But it's only very recently that this idea was implemented in international organizations. So this means that there's a problem of channeling concepts, our concepts, to the people that are conceiving the procedures and the processes there. So reforming, harmonizing the status of civil society and other stakeholders is key to democratization, but first we have to have the concept there. So in the end, let me reiterate my deep thanks to Samantha for making this conference possible. I think the issue, again, is extremely important. We are facing major challenges, and it's clear that good governance at the international level is a condition if we want to be able to respond to that challenges. And in this perspective, your work is a major contribution, including because it raises so much important questions and it allowed us to discuss so much important concepts. So thank you very much again. And now for the discussion.